We're talking about the central, big message of the Bible. Here it is. An all-powerful God lovingly seeks to live in loving fellowship with all mankind. Our big heading number 1 was the world begins. Home was created for mankind. Big heading 2, you remember? Man makes his appearance. Who is he? He's a plural unity, created by God to live in loving relationship with God and his neighbor. Number 3, why did God create in the first place? God tells us himself, I create because I'm a lover. I'm a lover of life. I share life. And my creation was an expression of love for mankind, giving him life and sustaining it. If God loved us so, if the world was such a marvelous place, would you tell me then, how come we've ended up in such a mess? Our big heading number 4. Paradise was lost. Not because God threw a fit or had a tantrum, but because something indescribably disruptive and evil entered. Christians call it sin. Call it what you want. The reality's there. Man couldn't blame his environment. Couldn't blame his parents. Tragedy struck in paradise. The inner big heading was landlessness. The homelessness of mankind. No, we said, didn't we, number 5, that the plot thickened. That was it. Eden wasn't an isolated affair. It wasn't just Adam and Eve. Heavens, it was everybody. And the world became very wicked and had to be dealt with. Then our big heading was the homelessness of mankind. We took a few minutes to talk about man's losing land and what significance that has in the Scriptures. Then we talked about number 7, Abraham and mankind coming home to God. Abraham is a new history beginning. He's the father of all believers. Romans 4 verse 11. God says in Abraham, world, come on home. I'll give you land. You can't seize it. I'll give it to you as a gift. I really do care about you. We then talked about the creation of Israel as the servant nation. Exodus chapter 19 verses 5 and 6 tell us that Israel, the seed of Abraham, through Jacob, was nationalized at Sinai. God brought them together, said, here's the covenant. What do you think? They said, we'll do it. He said, okay. Took the blood of animals, and they entered into a covenant, God and Israel. From Sinai onward, the Abrahamic seed is nationalized. It's a national community. But it's a servant nation. You see that theme all the way through. Election, choice, God choosing people. That theme of election that runs all the way through the Scriptures always has the story that the person or the people being elected are being elected not only for themselves, but for others. Why is that? Listen. It's because God doesn't care for only a few. Since He cares for everyone, since He loves all mankind, the choice of various individuals tells you what? that He's working to bless everyone. What we must never do is say, well, He chose Abraham, therefore He didn't give a hang about anybody else. 3 times He said, I choose Abraham that I might bless everybody else. When He chooses Israel and creates them, He creates a servant nation. Isaiah speaks of Israel over and over again as God's servant, not as God's pet. God's servant. Do you think the church needs to know that today? That we're not pets? God loves us all, Christian and non-Christian. Now then, number 10. The servant nation in the land. They came from Egypt. They entered a wilderness for 40 years, a great host on the move toward land, toward their inheritance. Behind them was Egyptian slavery. Before them was the fulfillment of all they've been longing for generations. Home. You know how the Jews are and how they view Israel. You've seen and heard them talk with that passion that only Jews can speak of about the land. Back in these days, they were going to Israel, moving back to God. God's grand servant nation was about to take its place in the land, to show the world what He wanted for all mankind. They were glad they were saying goodbye to the wilderness, but they were grim-faced knowing what was ahead of them. Lots of enemies there. This nation, listen to this, this nation was a miracle of God's redeeming grace. And He was about to set them in the midst of the nations. The land across the Jordan had been promised to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob all those years ago. And the nations of the land forfeited that land because of their wickedness. Genesis chapter 15 and verse 16 says this, in the 4th generation, your descendants will come back here, God speaking to Abraham. Your descendants will come back here, for the sin of the Amorites has not yet reached its full measure. God had given Canaan to the Amorites. They'd become so evil and intolerably wicked that they would be driven off land. Israel would be brought into that land. There are a number of things Israel must learn in entering the land, and they're all important to our overall study. None of these big themes is unrelated to the central message of the Bible. None of them. Israel must learn that the land she's getting is a gift. A gift. You see, the land is not just a piece of property. It's where they fellowship God. It becomes a synonym for life with God. And Israel must understand that the land is a gift. You remember Jacob? You remember how Jacob cheated his brother twice? You remember how he now comes to the ford of Jabbok and he's about to enter into the land of Canaan? He's been a con merchant all along. He's been tricky and deceitful. He got his brother's blessing and his birthright, both by deceit. And now he's going to enter in and get the land? What will he say later on down the years, just before he hobbles off this scene? Well, I'll tell you, I got it through my trickery. I got it because I was shrewd. I got it because I was stronger. I got it because I was more stubborn. God won't hear tell of it. He won't let Jacob set one foot on Canaan's land until he meets him at Jabbok. And what does he make him do at that river? He makes him admit what his name is. You remember how the angel said in Genesis chapter 32, what's your name? And Jacob finally admits, my name is Jacob, cheater. God won't let him enter Canaan thinking he got Canaan because of his shrewdness and his strength and all the rest of it. God makes him admit who he is, and then God says to him, I'll give you the land. I will give you the land. But to remind you that you didn't win it, that it wasn't your strength, wasn't your cheating, wasn't your shrewdness, that I gave it to you. Here, have this. And he touches his leg, and the man limps after that. And this is all written for Israel's benefit. The story about Jacob and the whole thing is written for Israel to know. When you enter that land, you're not going in there because you're shrewd. You're not going in there because you're strong. You're not going in there because you're great. You're not going in there because you're righteous. You're going in because I'm giving it to you. And what has that got to do with us? Because salvation, life with God, is a gift. And just as God chose out a bunch of sinners, stiff-necked and uncircumcised, and blessed them with the land, so he chooses out people like you and me and gives us the gift of life with him. Israel must learn that the land they're getting is a gift. At one point God said, go into the land and take it. They sent up spies. 10 of them came back saying, ooh, we can't do it. God said, that's it. All right, the wilderness for 40 years. What was Israel's response then? Do you remember? They said, ooh, don't like that wilderness. Let's go up and take the land. Okay, we're going to go in. God said, don't go, I'm not with you. But they went up anyway. They went up to seize it with the power of their arms. And what happened? It says the Amorites beat them all the way to Mount Hormah. God said, I wasn't with you. That was your mistake. You can't seize this land. I give it to you as a gift. And before he puts them in the land, what does he do? He takes away Moses. That'd frighten him, wouldn't it? The man that brought them out of Egypt, opened up the Red Sea, gave them the quail and the manna and all the rest of it under God. He took away Moses as leader. Now leaves them without the man they've been mad at him and all the rest of it. But yet, boy, they always looked to Moses. He was their leader. God takes him away. They're not using Moses as a crutch. Now he puts the younger man, Joshua, in as leader. Well, he's been under Moses, of course, but he's untried as the leader. Ooh. Israel shaking. Before he lets them get into the land, the river Jordan rises to its highest. They couldn't even walk across that water. They couldn't even get across the water to get into Canaan without God's help. So what does he do? But he tries up the river Jordan as he tried up the Red Sea. And when they get into the promised land, what's the first city that meets them? This big, gargantuan, fortified Jericho. And how will he take that? God won't even let him fire a shot. Why? He wants them to understand you get land as the gift. I give it to you. You don't earn it. Makes them walk around the city for 7 days. 13 times in silence. That must have been hard to take, huh? And then finally, they shouted, the priest blew the trumpets, and God's big fist smashed the walls. The proof that they got it because God gave it to them is in all of this. And then one day they went up against Ai while the wickedness was going on in the camp. And little old Ai kicked them from there to the Jericho fords. God said, well, you get this land. You get it as a gift. Ooh, and I forgot to mention that he had them circumcised at Gilgal. Huh? He had all the males circumcised. Now, if you check out the record in Genesis, circumcised males back then just didn't do any work. They don't do any work today. But they were sitting in the land vulnerable before all the enemies. And God preserved them during that vulnerable time. What's Israel learning? It's all a gift. Number 2, Israel must learn that the land is a gift from Jehovah. You know what the people back then thought? You know what the people today think? There are all kinds of gods. A God for fields and a God for rivers, a God for mountains, a God for this and a God for that. Gods for homes, gods for health, God for travel, God for this. All the various kinds of gods. Some gods you worship because you're really especially interested in that. You don't care about that, so you don't worship him, you worship the other. But you know what the multiplicity of gods creates? Division. The multiplicity of gods creates division. people start saying thank you to him, thank you to her, and not caring about this. Each nation gets its own God. Do you know what a multiplicity of gods produces? People divided from one another. People standing over against one another. One people standing with his God, battling with another people with their gods. God says, I want you to understand this. You get this land from me. And what is the Shema? One of the central affirmations of the Jewish scriptures. What is it? Hear, O Israel. The Lord our God is one Lord. James, in the book of James, says, you confess that there is one Lord, that God is one. You do well. Did you know that Jesus himself, in the Markan record of the question about the Great Commandment, says the Great Commandment is, Hear, O Israel, the Lord our God is one Lord, and thou shalt love the Lord your God with all your heart, soul, strength, and mind. God wasn't about to let these people give his glory to all these other gods. Not only because God is called jealous, not only because he insists, that's drivel, and that's rubbish, and my creation will not worship rubbish. I made you. You will glorify me in this living, loving relationship. For that. That's why God won't let them do it. Because all of that is muck and trash. And because it's important for man to be delivered from the evils around, the emptinesses around, and worship only him. For God is their life. God gives them their land. And number 3, Israel must learn that without obedience there's no blessing. They not only must learn the land is a gift, they not only must learn that the land is from Jehovah, they keep them from splintering, they keep them all to work together with the central oneness of the Godhead, spreading and teaching unity. They must learn that there's no blessing without obedience. What if they hadn't marched around Jericho as told? Huh? What if they hadn't crossed the Jordan when he said, step in, and as soon as the priest's feet step in, the waters will stop? What if they hadn't settled down and been circumcised at Gilgal and said, if we do that, sure we'll be vulnerable and the people will come get us? It would have been another wilderness wandering, wouldn't it? They're supposed to learn that while you cannot earn the gift, while you cannot earn the land, while you cannot earn fellowship and a home with God, you must obey. Why must you obey? Why can't God give you while you're disobedient? Because God is sovereign. Because there is no loving relationship when I say no to him. Because it's being disruptive to be disobedient. Because lovers seek to please one another. And when a man refuses and says no to God, he isn't loving God. There is no relationship. There is no fellowship. There has to be obedience. Not because it earns, but because there's no love without obedience. Jesus said, if you love me, what? You'll do as I tell you. Yeah. Joshua leads them into the land. They end up getting it. And Joshua reminds them in Joshua 23, verses 14 and 15, that not one thing has failed of all that God promised to you. Joshua 23, 14, 15. And in Joshua 21, 43 and 45, we're told, so the Lord gave Israel all the land he had sworn to give to their forefathers. And they took possession of it and settled there. Not one of all the Lord's good promises to the house of Israel failed. Every one was fulfilled. What does that tell you? It tells us that God is faithful, that he keeps his word. Will you believe that? When he tells you, when he comes telling you, I really do care. I will work with you. I will live with you. You believe him, will you? For he's one of those stones, tried and precious, a cornerstone, a foundation of life itself. Israel was God's model of man back home with God. We've got them in the land, all settled. God is there in the heart of them. They've all got their own little home in their own little section. They're all freed from oppression. What have we got now? God looks around and says to the nations, all right, now you see, here's my model. Man back home with God. Isn't that good news? That's part of the message of the Scriptures developing. Our next big heading, number 11. The servant nation and the rot which set in. God made Adam and Eve. They became wicked. God created Israel. They were wicked too. The book of Judges through 2 Chronicles is the record of the servant nation and the rot that set in. Genesis 1 through 11. Man's homelessness. Man lifing it all up. Genesis 12 through the end of Joshua. Man on his way back home to God. Man settling in and finding a whole second chance, a new beginning. Judges through 2 Chronicles. The servant nation and the rot that set in. As soon as Joshua died, things went downhill. Do you know the whole book of Judges is a portrait of Israel's wickedness? Repeatedly, and I do mean repeatedly, we're told, and the children of Israel did evil in the eyes of the Lord. Chapter 2, verse 11, verse 19, chapter 3, verses 7 and 12, chapter 4, verse 1, 6, verse 1, chapter 10, verse 6, and 13, 1, all say, and more, and the children of Israel did evil in the eyes of the Lord. In fact, the book of Nehemiah in chapter 9, 27 and 28 summarizes the whole history of Israel at this time by saying, God did them good, they became evil, God sent an oppressor, they repented and cried to the Lord saved them, they became wicked, and there it goes, that eternal cycle. Israel's wickedness, God's punishment, Israel's prayer for help, God's help given, and Israel's return to evil. The servant nation and the wrath that set in. Finally, the last of the judges and a man called Samuel, the first of the prophets, had two sons who were thugs. The children of Israel are fed up with it all, and they say in insolence, now remember, they say in insolence, we want a king over us, like all the nations round about. And Samuel is terribly distressed that they should want one. And God chooses a man called Saul, a Benjamite. God always intended for Israel to have kings. We learn that from Genesis 35:11 and Genesis 49:10. But he certainly didn't intend for Israel to do what they did in 1 Samuel 8. They were villainous and rebellious. They said, we want a king. They were rejecting God. He wouldn't allow himself to be rejected. And so he teaches them a lesson. He lets them choose Saul. Well, he lets them have Saul, a Benjamite. But inasmuch as he had promised in Genesis 49:10 that only the Davidic house would have the rulers, he knew that Saul was a mere temporary affair. Saul's a good guy at first, a humble man. But because of his wickedness, God has to reject him. And here's what God says to him in 1 Samuel 15. Although you were small in your own eyes, didn't you become head of the tribes of Israel? You've rejected the word of the Lord, and the Lord has rejected you as king over Israel. What's that all for? Well, it tells you, of course, about the history, but what for? Israel is to learn about their own loss of blessing because of their own loss of humility, because of their arrogance and their feeling superior. Finally, the Lord makes an everlasting covenant with a man called David, a boy. And one of the pivotal chapters of the Old Testament is Psalm 89. In Psalm 89, God said to David, with you and your children after you, I'm going to make a royal covenant. I'll never change my mind about it. Now, when your children are wicked, I'll beat them. I'll kick them from here to the Euphrates. But I'll never back off the covenant I've made. Within the covenant are these punitive elements. Within the covenant are the punitive elements. And when they're wicked, I'll punish them. And I'll let others rule Jews instead of them. But I'll never change my mind. Never, ever. The rot that set in resulted in Israel becoming extraordinarily wicked. And God sends her into prison, a national purgatory. The northern kingdom are taken off into captivity by the Assyrians. The southern kingdom are taken off into captivity by the Babylonians. The land of Canaan is virtually empty. Gentiles are now ruling over the nation Israel. The nation is crying in its pain and its isolation. But God promises, as He had done way back in the days of Moses, if you turn back to me in your heart, if you see that as chastisement and return to me, I'll return you to the land. For Israel must learn, not only is she elect to be blessed, she is elected to be a blessing. And that means that God will chastise her if He needs to make her a blessing. And so the whole history of Israel in captivity is Israel suffering. Is Israel suffering that she might bless the world. Now that's good news. Painful, but good news. Please return. God richly bless you.